Hey everybody, this is Perch. I want to tell you about this exchange I had, and I had it a couple of weeks ago, and I've been thinking like I want to do a video about this, but I also I do keep my conversations private. So can I do this video without talking about like how do I draw the line here for this topic? And I think I finally found a way, so we're going to do it. So this is called I don't know if what is the theme of this video? It's too long didn't read is it people are dumb, people don't know history? Is this hypocrisy? I don't think it's hypocrisy. I'm not sure. So let me lay it out for you, and you can help me in the comments kind of explain this. And you can also tell me if you find this as bafflingly weird and stupid as I do. So one of the things I've talked about in the past, and I do not get it, is there are in the early '90s 7 artists, Todd and Jim and Mark and Rob and other Jim and Eric. Sorry, just shit on Eric for no reason. But they left Marvel and they went to Image and they started making comics. And people who worked at Marvel at the time were pretty pissed off about that. Marvel proceeded to struggle and it was already going to happen. The world was tipping over. So I mean, there was I think that if you were Bob Harris in the early '90s at Marvel, you legitimately can be pissed. Now I think it doesn't mean that they did the wrong thing. I think those artists did the right thing, and it was good for the industry overall. And it was lots of good reasons. But I get why you're pissed. Like you can't sit there and go, I don't know why the Marvel was upset with these people who were their top stars suddenly leaving the company. Yeah, I mean, of course they're going to be upset by that. They should be upset by that, even though they weren't they were in the wrong but wrong anyway. You understand what I mean. I totally get that. What I don't get, though, is that I have conversations, and I had one a couple weeks ago with somebody, and they're people who work at Marvel, meaning staffers, not vendors, not contractors, not freelancers, but staffers at Marvel, who are still pissed about this. And for one, it is kind of dude, it's been 30 years. Like, you let it go. 30 years. You can, it's if you're still carrying that grudge around, then I think you have no place in bitching about toxic fandom pining for the past. I think that's absurd. But this is you're still pissed about this. Let it go. But the part that also the second part to that always drives me crazy is several of these people who and including the one I was talking to was not born when this happened. When Todd left Marvel and went to Image, made Spawn, this person was -4 years old. And I pointed this out. I'm like, you're talking about it not as like we got to prevent that from happening. That was a bad deal for Marvel. You're talking about it like a personal betrayal. You're talking about it like, this was somebody spit on your baby. You weren't alive. It's I get the cautionary tale. I get being concerned. I don't get the this weird like they personally betrayed me, because there was some comment that was made by it really felt like a stab in the back. I'm like, how was that a stab in the back when you were not born? Like it wasn't even, you weren't even old enough to feel like I was going to make a really crass abortion joke. It was like you were not born for what you're talking about. So how in the holy hell, how in the world does this make any sense? It doesn't. Anyway, I find that baffling. But here comes the one extra baffling part. So in this conversation we're having, and this is why I get to the is it just me or is this weird? They say, this is why, kind of the crux of this conversation, this is why I don't know why we're working with Rob Liefeld. And I said, well, Rob sells covers. He sells comics. I mean, he is a draw. Is he the same level of draw as he was in the early '90s? No, but he's also not a regular artist these days either. But he sells comics. That's why you're working with him, because he makes money. And it's, then I had the long lecture of like, Rob is way too much of a headache to work with. He's more baggage than he's worth. Yes, he makes some money, but the amount of ill will and badness he causes and discord, and everybody is pissed that, if nobody in the creative team wants to work with him, and they go on and on and on about Rob and how, just his very presence equals toxic, ugliness, and it's just bad. Everybody hates it. Bad. Um, and one, that's I don't believe that's true. Yes, but it is true that there are people on Twitter who do throw a tantrum. Yes, I do know that there are creative team members who throw down and refuse to work with Rob. So if Rob's going to be on a book, they, both on the editor's side, creative side, they're like, I won't work with that guy. He's bad. Did you see that he said? What was funny in the same conversation was a person like, he's so unprofessional on social media. Like, you got to be kidding me right now. Anyway, but regardless, I said, so we're going back, like, but he sells comics, and, I get that's tough to navigate, finding a creative team and everything else. I said, but, I said, it's probably not as hard as you think, because, people will say things like, I refuse to work with that guy. And you're like, okay, well, cool. I won't pay you. Then you can, I'll find somebody else to take that money. And they're like, well, maybe I'll work, but I'll be angry about it. And you're like, okay, well, have fun, kids. That's kind of, that's probably the approach you could take. But I go, so in this conversation, I go, I don't know, the talk looped back to, they abandoned us, and now here we are giving them work. I'm like, but I said, but you remember that in the later 90s, just a couple years, it wasn't actually that long, just a few years after they left to do Image, Weiss and Jim and Rob all came back to Marvel, or rather, Marvel gave them the Avengers titles as the Heroes Reborn. They gave them this imprint to kind of, they made a business deal to get these guys to do this work. And I've done videos about this in the past that I think, there's certain aspects that it interrupted, Wade and Garney's run on Cap in a way that was, jarring. And there's aspects about that were not clean and everything else. But this happened. Like, they did this like just a couple years later. It wasn't like, 20, 30, 25 years later, Marvel's sucking up to Rob Liefeld. They went and gave him money, 3 years later, and they did this. And here's the part, again, in this entire conversation, which feels like the Twilight Zone, was, no, they didn't. That was the response. I go, no, they did. Those comics exist. I'm like, no, this is Heroes Reborn. It's like, well, I never read any of that. I'm like, okay, but this is where I always, like, my brain starts to just shut down. So I'm like, I get it. I get you didn't read it, okay, but it still happened. This still occurred. There was still a thing called Heroes Reborn. There was still a business relationship that happened with Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and others just a couple of years after they left Image. That happened. Comics were made, and that's what occurred. And it was just well, I don't see what that has to do with anything. And I go, well, it has a lot to do with everything, because my point here is that companies do this stuff all the time. They go and what's a big act of betrayal and everything else one day turns into a business relationship the next day. So they did that because at the time those comics were struggling. They were trying to figure out how to get their head back in the game. They had suffered this embarrassment of losing people to Image. They discovered they could get a couple of those artists to come back and do work by giving up a little bit of control, but they were still, everybody was getting a lot of money out of the deal. And it didn't particularly work out. And, a little over a year later, it went back to, how it was, but it arguably gave, several titles a big boost. And I think the whole Heroes Reborn moment in time is kind of one of those things where there's a lot of different learnings that came out of it. It's not as clean as like, well, those comics all sucked, or, it was a massive success. It was a little bit of all of those things. you can make the argument if you really like the Kurt Busiek, George Perez Avengers that came about. It's questionable if that would have happened if not for the Heroes Reborn and kind of that entire moment in time. So I mean, there's a lot of factors here, I guess is my point. But I find the whole so there's my story, and what I kind of hand over to you is I don't know what to make of all that. So there's a bunch of takeaways. One, full-time staffers at Marvel not knowing their basic history, which just feels I don't know, sad, scary, weird, funny. You pick. Strange. What is the dynamic? Like, when do you let these things go? When does a grudge end? What do you do if you bring a Rob Liefeld in and he's a veteran, but some of the new people on Twitter don't like Rob Liefeld? Like who's that jackass who's always bitching about? Gabe, not Gabe. Gabe, it's not Gabe. The guy, he's a DC artist and he always shits on John Byrne. Yeah. Anyways, one of you guys will. One of you will remember. Anyway, he's always bitching about John Byrne. But DC makes a lot of money off John Byrne. They did his Superman omnibus, and it sold really well and continues to sell well on Amazon. And right now, if John Byrne said, "You know what? I'll come and I'll take a reasonable page rate, and I'll do a mini series for DC." You think DC wouldn't jump at that? Well, then again, DC's kind of dumb, so who knows? They might not. But in any rational world, they would. So what do you do with these people who are like, well, I've been shitting on him for last year and I won't work with him now? Like, what do you do with that? And Rob is got a social media presence, heavy following. Whether you like what he says or not, he brings attention. If part of the games of comics is to bring attention, and that's what we've been told for the last several years, then he's successful, right? So anyway, lots of dynamics. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for listening.